Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today are Stephen Moore and Colby Barett. Stephen Moore is the founder of the Ukraine Freedom Project. He came to Ukraine on day 5 of the war when Kiev was surrounded on 3 sides by Russians and has been in Ukraine most of the time since then. He's been to the front more than a dozen times when not in Ukraine. He's been in DC educating former Capitol Hill colleagues. And now he and Colby are um, working on introducing the public to a documentary, um, Faith Under Siege, The Hidden War on Ukraine's Christians. We'll be talking more about what that is, what the film is about, and what that actual hidden war, or not so hidden, if you ask me, and the consequences of ignoring it or listening to the Russian narratives regarding this issue. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll actually start with a basic question to you both. What made you interested in Ukraine? And how and why did you get involved in the war and in the related issues?
Yeah, Rena, thanks for having us on, and I'll start with that. I have no connection to Ukraine, but this summer a friend called me up and asked whether I wanted to go on a humanitarian aid convoy, and I told him absolutely not. There's a war going on there. I've got 4 kids. We also run a farm. It's right in the middle of harvest season, but really started kind of thinking about it and my faith really called me to go and to help there and also to tell this story. I feel like I'm one of those kind of people that follow the news pretty well, and I started researching what was happening to religious minorities in Ukraine, particularly evangelical Christians. And the numbers were staggering. We saw 47 priests and pastors killed, 630 churches destroyed. That number has actually gone to 650. So once I saw that, I really felt called to go and to tell this story.
Well, your efforts have been quite inspiring. How was it getting on the ground so early on? And I'll get to Colby in a moment, right after I kind of get this background from you.
Yeah, sure. So my connection to Ukraine is not familial. I know as far as I know, I have no Ukrainian blood in me. Um, sort of I'm a uh, average American, descended from British settlers and that sort of thing. So, but freedom is very important to me, and it's one of my core values. And I really came to understand that in Ukraine, because Ukraine is all about people fighting oppression for their freedom. And and I went to Ukraine on in 2018, 2019. Spent a year there working and loved it. Made a lot of Ukrainian friends, and then coincidentally got a job in an AI firm, American AI firm that had like 500 Ukrainian employees. So I had all these Ukrainian friends, and I left the AI firm in January of 2022, and was just kind of in between jobs, and my Ukrainian friends started calling me and saying, "They're bombing Kyiv. I don't know what to do." And so that got my attention. And I worked in Iraq as a civilian for the first couple of years of that war, and I knew what to do. So I hopped on a plane, flew into Bucharest, and drove across the border near Chernivtsi on day 5 of the war.
Were you not, how were you handling your safety concerns? After all, many people were terrified, afraid of potential hit by a missile or something like that, or an attack. And of course, Russia was at the time was talking about taking Kiev on 3 days. I mean, day 5 meant that they failed at that, but it still could have been pretty close.
Yeah, Irina, the line to get out of Ukraine was a lot shorter, a lot longer than the line to get into Ukraine. Yeah, funny. And when I got there, I thought like everyone else, the Russians are going to roll through there in 3 weeks. So I actually from Trinity, I figured out how to hike to the border, and I bought a pair of wire cutters, those big bolt cutters, in case I had to cut through the border fence because the Russians were on the way. So, fortunately, it didn't even come near to that. But I remember one of the biggest decisions I've ever made in my life was whether to follow Google Maps on the route to Kyiv or to follow what I knew to be areas that were not occupied. If I follow Google Maps, I'm gonna die.
Oh
So
my gosh.
yeah, and so we went the longer route. But yeah, it was intense. When I arrived in Kyiv, it was surrounded on three sides by Russians. Now I have to drive 10 hours to find a Russian because Ukrainian bravery and American weapons have driven the Russians out of most of Ukraine.
So that's part of the story that not being, in my opinion, sufficiently pushed in the media. These experiences of seeing the vast difference between the early days of the war and where we are now. In fact, the overwhelming majority of, for instance, Republicans seems to think that Ukraine is losing the war or on the brink of losing the war, which is obviously not the case. Not to say that the situation isn't difficult or dire, but clearly this is a far cry from those early days of the invasion. So once you got there, what was your role, and how did you go from there, from just being on the ground in response to the desperate pleas of your friends, to forming the Ukraine Freedom Project? And what is that exactly for those who are not familiar?
Yeah, sure. The Ukraine Freedom Project is the NGO I formed when I got my first credit card bill, and so I had been putting a lot of supplies, a lot of medical supplies on my credit card. Got it back. I was like, "Whoa, I need to raise some money." So I started a 501(c)(3), the Ukraine Freedom Project, and so I could raise money. We've raised, oh gosh, we've got about 1,200, between 1,200 and 1,300 donors. We've raised, oh, probably close to $2 million, something like that. And we've gotten even more supplies to the front because we get a lot of stuff donated. Um, we're now less in the humanitarian aid business because I don't need to compete with Samaritan's Purse, let's say. But what I do best, what I've been doing all my life, is I worked in Republican politics all my life. So I am good at
Mhm.
changing public opinion, good at giving people factual, truthful, persuasive information that makes them understand what's really going on in Ukraine. And I think that Colby with the movie has adopted that technique as well.
Mhm. But so basically, it was a humanitarian fundraising project and also information, providing accurate information to the policymakers and media influencers. To what
Yeah,
extent? Mhm.
go ahead,
I was
please.
going to ask, to what extent do you think you succeeded? I mean, the fundraising portion is clear, but in terms of changing hearts and minds on this matter, um, do you think what kind of an impact do you think you made? How did you measure progress in that respect?
Good question. I think one of the ways that we can definitively measure our efforts was that you may recall that every Democrat in the U.S. House of Representatives joined seven members, Matt Gaetz and six other members of the Moscow caucus of the Republican Party, and voted out Kevin McCarthy, who was the pro-Ukraine Speaker of the House. That was a good day for Russia in the House of Representatives. And because the man who succeeded him was Mike Johnson, who at the time had voted 9 out of 9 available times against aid to Ukraine. And so everybody thinks, oh my gosh, we're doomed. But again, there's information that you can give Republicans and conservatives and Christians that is persuasive. It's if they people get the truth works. Good news in today's world, the truth still works. So we visited 100 congressional offices, and I got about 80 pieces of in the newspaper, and when I say newspaper, I mean more broadly in the media. A lot of newspapers behind me, but so and and it was persuasive. And in the end, it took about 6 months, but Mike Johnson uh, put his job on the line as the third most powerful American to get the Ukraine aid bill passed in April of last year. So we helped with that. It's just, Mike Johnson was a Baptist activist prior to joining Congress. The Baptists are the uh, fourth largest denomination. No, sorry, the largest Protestant denomination, the third largest Christian denomination in Ukraine. Baptists are getting tortured and murdered for their faith. They're getting targeted. It helped to get this information to Republicans in Congress.
So I will get back more to that in a moment, but I also wanted to hear from Colby about how he got interested in this topic. Colby, how did you get involved in all this?
Yeah, it's kind of an unusual story. Like Steve and I really have no connection to Ukraine, so no Ukrainian background. I don't know. I can't actually think of any Ukrainian friends that I had prior to this mission this summer. But I was getting ready to go do a humanitarian aid convoy and just started doing more and more research on what's going on over there, and it frankly it shocked me and it seemed unbelievable. And just the level of intense persecution the Russians are inflicting upon especially evangelicals in Ukraine. And I felt that getting out there and telling that story was very key. And I have no background in documentary filmmaking. Right. So one of the cool things was I do have a background in putting good teams together. I used to run a 900 person business. I served in the Marine Corps as an intelligence officer and ran scout sniper platoons and infantry platoons. So I know how to build a team. And that's exactly what we did for A Faith Under Siege. We found one of the best film crews on the ground in Ukraine. And then post-production was all done in New York. And again, one of the best in the business did that. And then the missing piece really was we had all the infrastructure in place, but how do you go find Christians that have been suffered, have lost loved ones, have been tortured? In one case, one of the people we interviewed, a Russian Orthodox priest, had actually tried to cast demons out of him while he was being tortured. How do you
Mhm.
find these people and talk to them? Um, I'm just some guy, some foreigner coming in there. And that's where Steven's team came in. They were really the bridge because they had talked to a lot of these people over the years and had built up great relationships. So to go in there, the project, The Faith Under Siege, was really not about what does Colby think about Ukraine? What does Steven think about Ukraine? It was hearing direct stories from believers that had suffered through this directly. And that's where Steven's team came in. It was immediate access to, I think we talked to over 40 people that had suffered in this war at the hands of the Russians in different ways. So that was the third piece of the puzzle and really the most important piece to making A Faith Under Siege come together.
Um, this is this is amazing. How, by the way, how did you guys meet, by the way?
How
Steve,
did you
I'm gonna
find
let you
me?
tell me this. Yeah. I
What's that?
I think it was a friend of a friend was knew that we were working on this project and said, "Hey, you need to talk to Stephen Moore and Ukraine Freedom Project because they've done a lot of work in this space." And yeah, I can't put exactly the in my sense it was kind of God brought us together. But it is one that's been an amazing relationship. And Stephen and I and his team traveled the entire length of the front lines
Mhm.
back in September. So that was, from Kharkiv up in the north all the way down to Kherson
That's
in
where
the
I'm
south.
from Kharkiv.
Oh
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
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 Um,
That's what. Yeah. So as you can see, as you can imagine, I've been following that portion of the combat very closely, in particular. So.
those stories that we heard in Kharkiv were some of the most inspiring. The way the the city came together to single-handedly keep the Russians at bay. And these were just people. We talked to a lady named Olga who she's a librarian. And she basically coordinated the whole logistics effort for defense of the city, and just fantastic individuals there. It kind of reminded me of the. I mean, of course, I have no firsthand experiences, but when you read about the American Revolution, just normal people coming together to hold off a stronger empire that's kind of, bent on their destruction, and they just came together and made it happen. It was very inspiring to see and to meet these people.
It's kind of really interesting how you guys are reframing the story around the Ukrainian people, whereas the focus of the official Ukrainian diplomacy has been very much on government efforts and on the PR coming from that circle, and it's almost been sort of a tension. And to what extent did you feel support of the Ukrainian authorities, or was it an entirely independent thing that was not in any way didn't touch on the official formal Ukrainian lobbying in any way?
Yeah, we didn't have any, obviously the officials didn't stop us in any way, but there
Hmm.
wasn't any government support to this other than, getting the permissions to go near the front line.
Sure.
This was we just wanted to tell this story. And
Hmm.
so that was the, pretty organic effort. But yeah, we didn't see any pushback from Ukrainian officials, but they also really didn't know what we were doing. So
Mm.
they gave us the permissions we needed just as journalists to go near the front lines. But that's I guess that would other than approving press passes, I think that was the level of support. It was also helpful. We had I mentioned we came into Ukraine on a humanitarian aid convoy. Most of those vehicles were donated from the Finns. So they were all
Mm.
had Finnish
Hmm.
license plates on them. And the aid convoy let us borrow those for a few weeks while we went through Ukraine, and eventually, were able to donate those vehicles. But that was nice because when you have foreign plates, the checkpoints are a lot easier as well. So I would say a lot of kudos for getting us through checkpoints, but there wasn't really much more government action in anything we were doing.
So
The
what?
Zero Line, was that Zero Line was the convoy that you guys did?
Yeah, Zero Line, yeah, zeroline.org, and these guys are fantastic. Obviously, we're focusing on the film on this
Sure.
discussion, but those guys are a couple different MIT graduates that are doing some humanitarian aid, especially supporting frontline responders.
Hmm.
So
Oh, wow, very
EMTs,
nice.
firefighters, and mine clearing crews. And they basically go in, very un-American way to do it. The American way to do it is come in and say, "Hey, here's all this stuff. I'm here to help." These guys come in and first ask questions on
Mm.
what do you actually need,
It,
and then put convoys together and brought it in. So when we came in with our convoy, it was like scuba gear, and I was like, "What do you need scuba gear for in Ukraine?" And it was really to help some of the mine clearing crews in the rivers. The
mm.
Russians had mined a lot of the rivers, and they needed even just basic scuba gear to be able to clear some of these mines so they could get commerce going again in those rivers. So that was a fantastic partnership with a nonprofit there to help make this film and this project possible.
So, it's funny. I can't help but make a wry comment here because the Republicans are so focused on the costs of the Ukraine war effort and U.S. official support. But it sounds to me like a lot of things were being done creatively, efficiently, and by entirely private efforts, and that these sort of things seems somehow do not figure into this formal calculus of how much the war cost and who is paying for it.
I would agree with that, and there's it's really funny. I'm old enough to remember when the Republican, I guess it was liberals, used to say that I'd like to see the Department of Education fully funded and have to have and see the U.S. Department of Defense hold a big sale for a B-2 bomber. Um, but in Ukraine, that's what they do. They hold a bake sale. They hope to raise funds for gear for their military, and the cost of this war, that that's gone to Ukraine is significantly less than people think. There's been uh, about $80 million in um, $80 million in weapons sent, about $25 million billion. Let's use a B. so 80 about $80 billion in weapons sent, about $25 billion in aid, that like financial aid for various things. And even I've been to the front like 50 times, and even the weapons sent are overpriced. And as an example, a we have a friend, Max, who is done very well in the military. He was like this party guy. He actually, like organized parties for a living, raves, that sort of thing. And when the war started, he just jumped in the military. And because he was so entrepreneurial, he excelled. And so one day his commanding officer said, "Max, we need to get you to bring some Bradley fighting vehicles from the Polish border to the front lines in Donetsk." And so he 80 of them, and he created a convoy, and only like 50 of them made it the entire way because 30 of them were stranded at the side of the roads because they did not function. So the price and of course, the U.S. Department of Defense has not passed an audit in 7 years, so there's no price list for what a Bradley costs. But Croatia bought some Bradleys, and they were $1.9 million each. But they didn't have a price for, you know, spare parts for Bradleys. So when you calculate it out at 80 Bradleys at 1.9 million, it's not an actual number for working Bradleys. Essentially, the U.S. Department of Defense dumped their military trash in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians were happy to get it. They took those 30 Bradleys that didn't work, and they made they made them spare parts. They made several Bradleys out of them, so that 30 Bradleys became 10 Bradleys. So that was so, but the American people are not being accurately informed of the real cost of this war, or the real benefits of this war.
One
I
of
was
the
go ahead, sure.
I was going to say one of the things that really stood out to me is the first night we were in Kiev. Stephen took us to meet a friend of his. So we went out, right before curfew, but it was the sun was down, and it was a Supreme Court justice, an opera singer, and a cab driver on the top of a building on the outskirts of Kiev, and they were a drone defense crew. And when we asked them, kind of how that worked, they work for free. They're not paid by the Ukrainian military. They buy their own uniforms. And the only thing they had gotten from the government was ammo and two 1945 Czechoslovakian machine guns. So they had taken these machine guns and built their own mount. They had put night vision on that, all out of their own pocket. And this Supreme Court justice basically spends, I think, something like 60% of his salary to upgrade his position and those kind of things. But they're not paid. These were civilian volunteers. And that once I saw that kind of answered all the questions of how committed are Ukrainians in this struggle, and how willing are they to fight and spend their own money to make stuff happen. That kind of answered that question for me.
I kind of was hoping that Doge would uncover these sort of inefficiencies rather than focusing on transgenic mice and things of that nature. But
Yeah.
I guess you get what you pay for with some of these government structures. Mm, so, getting back to this, there were obviously from just what you told me now, there's been many amazing stories and storylines and very important humanitarian issues and that needed to be uncovered and needed to be told, and we're simply not reaching through the noise and through the political debates into the
Yeah.
heartland of the United States. How and why did you decide specifically to focus on the Christian persecution as opposed to one of the many other ways to reach the American people?
I think this is one that it really highlights Russia's purposes behind their invasion, in who they go after tells you all you need to know about why they're invading, in my opinion. So if you look at when the Russians will come into a portion of Ukraine, the typical people they would go after, journalists and activists and local leaders and those kind of things. And that's all kind of normal in war. It's horrible, but that's
Hmm.
kind of what you see. The next place they go is the local evangelical church. And that will either be seized or destroyed. The pastor will be killed or forcibly deported. And, a lot of people would say, this is really, why does this happen, right? Russia's a majority Christian nation. Why would they
Hmm.
come in and attack other Christians? And the reason is really interesting. So, first is if you're a Baptist, in the eyes of a Russian soldier coming in, you are an American spy. And this was something it took me a long time to understand. Why would they think that a Baptist is automatically working for the CIA or America in some sort? And the reason is if you look at the Russian Orthodox Church, it is effectively an arm of the Russian state. So Patriarch Kirill, who's the leader there, worked for the KGB alongside Vladimir Putin. The FSB is throughout that organization. So it has become kind of the religious arm of the Russian state, supporting these kind of aggressive measures. So if you're a Russian soldier, you see the Russian Orthodox Church, obviously that's completely aligned with the Russian state. You come and see a Baptist, that's your paradigm, right? That is obviously aligned with the American state because that's an American religion. It's not true, but that explains part of that. The second
Hmm.
piece is uh, when Russia comes in to Ukraine, they're not welcomed as liberators, right? They're really, really not welcome there, right? As much as they thought they were going to be, in bringing their dress uniforms when they invaded, right? Um, but that's not the case. The Ukrainians don't want them there. They want freedom and independence, not oppression. And so, as they come in, they'll find religious organizations that don't have a strong hierarchy. So, in the most evangelical and Protestant churches, there's not like an infrastructure that they can try to control. We talked to somebody that said, we just have one leader, it's Jesus Christ. And so, if you're an occupying and invading power, if you've got a group of people that don't have earthly authorities to answer to, they're really hard to control because they're going to be making their decisions based on bigger picture items. And so that's another reason that they really go after these churches. First, that American nexus, or perceived American nexus, and the fact that they just can't control them because their loyalties lie elsewhere. And that's, they kind of go down the list then. Usually evangelicals are first. Then Catholics are a few months later, and then they'll kind of go down the list of basically any religious minority along that line. So it's really troubling to see, but hearing these stories firsthand really got me to understand like why Russia's invading and how they want to control the population as they come in.
So
And
that.
I would add to that
Mhm.
just it's really it's well documented that the Kremlin is going after evangelical Christians. And if you look at some of the stats, Colby had mentioned earlier, there's as much as 650 churches that have been destroyed by the Russians, and like a third of them are evangelical churches. Now, evangelical Christians make up 4% of Ukraine's population. And similarly, there's been 47 faith leaders that that have been killed by the Russians, and 22 of them, almost half, are evangelical Christian leaders. Now, and again, 4% of Ukraine's population is Baptist, Pentecostal, and other evangelical denominations. So there's no way to describe this other than Vladimir Putin is targeting evangelical Christians disproportionately in his efforts to conquer Ukraine.
It's funny, many people may not be aware, but Russia has also been uh, persecuting evangelicals inside its own territories, and that's been going on for longer than the war in Ukraine. It's been going on for decades, and no one has really focused on that. I mean, it's religious persecution, but the State Department reports on religious freedom don't necessarily highlight it all that much. Even if it's there somewhere, it's not really being openly discussed. And you have all these people flocking to Russia, claiming that it's such a religious country, when it actually is more likely to persecute people like them than to embrace them on an official level, which I've always found a very fascinating counterpoint that is not really being pushed all that much. But that brings me to my next question. What are some of the stereotypes, myths, and assumptions that you've had to confront in encountering these stories and making the film?
Yeah, I think that's a
How
great
much time
point.
do we have?
Yeah.
We we
Go
might
ahead.
have to do more than one
Yeah.
episode.
Go
I
ahead,
think
Colby.
yeah, I think you see this too with the perception that, Russia is a Christian nation that is protecting traditional family values, and you hear people say stuff like, Putin is the defender of Christianity and all these kind of things, and it's really, really backwards. And what you mentioned, some of these things in terms of Christian persecution in Russia go back decades. So back in 2010, Putin started hinting at this. So he said, Russian Orthodoxy, which is the church that's aligned with the state, is closer to Islam than it is to Western Christianity, i.e., Protestantism and Catholicism. That
That's a
was a
very,
pretty
yeah, that's a
groundbreaking
very
statement.
important point, because the same people, by the way, who are, obsessed with the defense of Christendom, many of them don't particularly care for Muslims in general and are
Right.
greatly concerned about the Islamist threat for sure. And
Exactly.
Russia
Yeah.
made a big show of designating the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization and banning it, but on the other hand, has fomented Islamist movements both inside its territories and outwardly, quite ironically. And now what you just said is a very interesting comment to highlight
Yeah.
in that
I
respect.
think it's the way they view faith is it's a method to control people, and it's a
Mhm.
method to engage in warfare. And this is actually was put out in 2024. The Russian Orthodox Church in a group called the 25th World Russians People's Council,
Mhm.
which was the keynote speaker there was Putin, and it was Patriarch Kirill that ran it, declared a holy war against Ukraine and the West. So a lot of people don't understand Russia's declared a holy war on America here.
This is
And, as a
literally a
Christian,
crusade slash jihad version of.
it's yeah, no, and you hear those words too. So one of the guys we talked to that had escaped from the occupied territories, his area was controlled by Ramzan Kadyrov. So this is a Chechen warlord who, when he came into Ukraine, declared a quote Orthodox Muslim jihad against Ukrainians. So this concept of holy war in more of the Islamic tradition there is something that you see throughout Putin's discussions, as well as the people that he's put into power. And it's not a thing that has any kind of basis in Christianity. There isn't like a Christian jihad. It's not, it's not a thing. Our struggle as Christians is against the devil and evil and, those kind of things, but never against people, never against, flesh and blood. So this concept of corrupting Christianity into this geopolitical force for destruction is something as a Christian is really tough to see. It's really a corruption of the religion and the faith there. So that was one of the things that we really tried to bring up in the film A Faith Under Siege was just how perverted this take on Christianity is that Putin is pushing out there. You don't use faith to justify taking over your neighbor. I mean, if you want to take over your neighbor, that's obviously, something that happens, but you can't plausibly use the Christian faith there. But what you see is the Russian budget for 2025 came out and they allocated $1.61 billion to propaganda. That's a 13% increase from 2024. And that's where you really see what's going on here. Russia is fighting this war in a couple different places. The only place that they're really winning is the propaganda aspect. And unfortunately, you see this being taken up by some conservatives, even some Christians in the US. And that has been perplexing for me. But when you spend $1.61 billion, like you're going to see some traction. And some of these things, I don't know, Stephen, what the numbers were of, I think, $10 million that they just uncovered of Russians paying uh, influencers on the right. And that's just what they know about.
Mm-hmm.
So, spending a lot of money on trying to win over this audience. Thankfully, it's not really working. I think the approval rating of Putin amongst Republicans in the last poll I saw was like 5%. So they're not buying it, but enough are that it's troubling. And this is why we wanted to tell the film in this way is again, not having Colby talk about what he thinks about Ukraine or Stephen talking about what he thinks about Ukraine, but hearing directly from Christians that have suffered, um, hearing their firsthand stories. Because you don't, in my opinion, you don't fight propaganda with more propaganda. You fight propaganda with the truth. And the best truth is that's coming directly out of the mouths that of people that have lived and experienced this firsthand. That was the whole point of the movie was to get these folks to be able to tell their story to American Christians or Americans in general that can see that and take the appropriate actions or understand what's going on there. Because that's, 100% of the time when people are presented, the people that we've seen see this movie, when they're presented with the truth firsthand, it moves them. So.
Given that both Russia and Ukraine come from, they're in the same region, they have similar, not the same, but similar religions, and they're both majority Christian, although very diverse. Why is it that it was Russia that somehow was seen as a so-called defender of Christendom, as opposed to any other country in the region, why is there such a big distinction between Russia and Ukraine being made? And I mean, I started to focus my attention on this during Russia's campaign in Syria, but even there, no one really claimed, other than the Russians themselves, that they are really defending Christians. The Syrian Christians certainly did not make that claim. And how is it that suddenly this attention as the great leader of the Christian world was on Russia when it was an aggressive actor in many states? It invaded Georgia. It massacred Christians in Georgia. That's long predates the its interference in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think they've been really concerted about the effort there. So you look
Mm-hmm.
at Vladimir Putin, the amount of images of him, kissing a cross or kissing Patriarch Kirill or attending religious services. Even recently, saying that he was praying for President Trump after I think the first assassination attempt there. So there's been this very concerted PR effort on the behalf of the Russian state to
Mm.
present Putin as a leader of the faith, a very devout Christian. And then I mentioned, the billions in propaganda money that's spent there. And I think that's, intentional to try to win over religious conservatives here in the US. It's garbage. If you look at if you're murdering pastors, you're kind of not on the Christian side of the equation there. And if you're intentionally targeting children, I think they just killed 9 kids in a strike on a playground, and this was less than a week ago. The Russians in their missile attacks. They've abducted, I think the number that we know now is 19,546 children abducted by Russia, sent to a series of 43 camps across the Russian occupied areas or Russia itself to re-educate these kids in um, Russian citizenship, and in some cases to militarize them so they can come back to fight against their country. Or, and this is something we learned about during our interviews, actually training these kids to hate the West for
Hmm.
the next stage of the war, which is going to be against the West. That's the narrative that if you were one of these abducted kids and you were sent to one of these military camps, you'd be first taught to hate Ukraine, your native country. Secondly, you'd be taught to hate and get ready to fight against the West, i.e., America, because that's the next stage in the war. And that's the thing I think a lot of people just don't understand. When you're admiring Putin, they're not our friends. Putin is not your friend, right? He's murdering folks that believe the same way you do. He's repressing folks that love freedom the way you do. A lot of the conflicts that the US has been in the last 50 years have been messy and gray, right? You look at Iraq and Vietnam and all these ones, they're just like, you know, they're tough and they're complicated. This one's not.
Hmm.
This one is, and it's in the American paradigm, we're just used to seeing stuff as messy and gray and bad people on both sides and those kind of things. This is more like World War II, right? There's the good guys here and the bad guys there, and we need to help the good guys because it's very clear who's fighting for freedom and democracy and religious pluralism and these kind of things, and who's fighting for the exact opposite of that, repression and uh, and the destruction of faith. I mean, that's why we made the title of the movie "A Faith Under Siege" is really the destruction, the intentional destruction of faith in the Russian occupied portions of Ukraine. It's a concerted effort to wipe out faith and replace it with kind of um, a religion that's more just a badge than it is an actual faith. And so that's it's tough to see, but the seeing the way the Ukrainians are fighting back is something that was really, really heartening for us.
I would say that in very stark terms that what the Russians are doing is not any different than what the communists were doing to people of faith back in the day. Unfortunately, those parallels are not being brought back in those very clear moral terms, and so for that reason, there is this confusion around what is actually happening. But this is actually where I wanted to ask you, as I mentioned, obviously both Russia and Ukraine are Christian majority countries, but what are some of the differences, how they treat and deal with religion? And, we mentioned that Russia basically a state political intelligence apparatus. How is that different from what Ukraine is doing?
Yeah, I think one of the things that a lot of Americans don't know is that in 2016, Russia passed a series of laws called the Eurovia laws. And if you just Google Eurovia laws, those will come up. That made it illegal to preach the gospel in public places in Russia. So if I want to tell you about Jesus and I go do it, I'm sitting at a bus stop with you and I say, hey, let me tell you about Jesus. That can get me put in jail in Russia and now in the occupied parts of Ukraine. The only time I can actually do that is if I have the right paperwork and I'm in my church and you somehow come into my church, I can then preach the gospel. That was shocking to me to know
Hmm.
about that. In Ukraine, there's none of those kind of rules. Ukraine's one of the most pluralistic religious countries that you'd see. There's Baptists and Pentecostals and Orthodox and Jews and Muslims. And, one of the things that they try to do is to encourage faith. There's a national prayer breakfast. They have a thriving chaplaincy corps, even a national holiday for chaplains. And all this stuff is new, right? Back in 1991, they were still theoretically communists, right? And so all these things getting built so quickly is something that shows that, the Ukrainians believe in faith and the power of faith in there and the freedom to be able to worship the way you want. If you want to go to an Orthodox church, great. If you want to go to a Protestant church, that's awesome. So it's like it is in America in terms of being able to worship any way you want, be able to pick your religion. Whereas in the occupied territories, if you pick one that Russia doesn't like, that opens you up to being killed, forcibly deported, or having to worship in secret. Um, at the very least, it's a bunch of crazy rules. So We talked to one guy that had just fled, and he said, unless you have 30 Russian passports at a service, it can't be a sanctioned service. So not only do you have to register your church, you have to register every person in the church, and you have to have 30 Russian passports there to hold a service. And I don't need to tell you or anybody else, when you start putting religious minorities on lists, that's not a good trend, right? Bad
Mm.
things happen when that comes up.
I would say it's a pre-genocidal, proto-genocidal move right there.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and yeah, so what I would say is that Putin has not only persecuted religious minorities, he's persecuted religious majorities.
Hmm.
A majority of Ukrainians are members of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine that has the patriarch that reports, and they're a patriarch in Kiev. And those people are not faring well under Russian rule. Vladimir Putin has shut down every church that is not controlled by the Kremlin in occupied Ukraine. So it's not even like conventional religious persecution that you might think of in Africa or Asia or someplace. Some of the things we're more familiar with. And going back to your point about the Soviet Union, we've talked to a lot of believers who lived through the Soviet Union and lived through Russian occupied Ukraine, and they say Russian occupied Ukraine is worse for believers than the Soviet Union. So, like for me, I remember going to church as a kid, and these missionaries would come and talk about the experiences they had smuggling Bibles behind the Iron Curtain and stuff, and that sort of thing. And it was vivid to me. I imagined this. I could, smell the basements that they were hiding in. And now what people are telling me in occupied Ukraine is it's worse than those things we heard about in the 80s.
The difference is we talked to one pastor. He said he grew up during the Soviet times, and at his school, when the teacher found out that he was a Christian, she brought him up to the front of the classroom, and everybody laughed at him because she said, this guy's a Christian. He has something wrong with his brain. That was and so all the kids pointed and laughed. So obviously, kind of a humiliation kind of stuff. The folks that have lived through both regimes, the Soviets and now the Russian occupation, say it's a lot like the Soviets, but the level of brutality is much higher, right? So your chances of being laughed at are not as high as your chance of actually being murdered or tortured, or as the Russians call it, being taken to the basement, right? That's the euphemism for torture there that so many Christians and other religious minorities have gone through under Russian occupation. So that the difference then uh, isn't so much the intent behind it, but the way it's being carried out is much more brutal than during Soviet times.
It's just
And I and
unbelievable.
I and I just want to add something that Colby had touched on, is the way that I got involved in working with Ukraine's oppressed Christians is, as in late 2022, I met this guy named Victor, and Victor, uh, I met him in like a co-working facility in Kiev. Victor comes up to me and says, "Hi, I'm Victor, and I'm an evangelical Christian." And it's like, all right, dude, great, because Christians are not as forward about their faith. It's not the first thing they say in America, but evangelical Christians in Ukraine are that evangelical. And by the way, if you're in the occupied territories and you introduce yourself that way, you're going to jail. So, but Victor came up to me and said this, and then he told me about, and again, Colby alluded to this story, is that he was helping families, groups of people come out of occupied Luhansk in 2014. And one day he had a group that included a pregnant woman and a newborn infant. And he was driving down the road. The Russians pulled him over, pulled him out of his car, and took him to the basement, which, they tortured him. That's what they say. They took me to the basement, and he was there for 25 days. And he was praying with one of his fellow prisoners, and the Russians heard him. They took him to the torture room and started torturing him with an electrical taser. And there was a Russian Orthodox priest present who was trying to cast demons out of him because he's an evangelical Christian. And yeah, this is a mind-blowing story. I was like, and about the same time, I heard Tucker Carlson start talking about Zelensky persecuting Christians, which is just utter nonsense. I'm like, I live here. I don't see that happening, and so it really made me want. And I just thought, Republicans were just drifting away from Ukraine at that point. I was like, if they knew what was really going on here, then they would come around. They would understand how important this is. And that's kind of what we found is that Christians who vote Republican and listen to these stories are their brains short circuited, and they say, "What do we got to do? How do we get this information out? We got to tell people about this." So, and that's the power of our movie, A Faith Under Siege. It gives people that immersive experience. So that's kind of how I came about doing what I'm doing, and Colby is taken it to the next level with our film. So it's a really exciting thing to be a part of.
You know, there's been a lot of stories related to the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine causing problems, using intelligence recruitment tactics. Um, you just mentioned that Russia simultaneously cast a fictitious narrative about Zelensky allegedly shutting down churches when, Ukraine has been struggling to shut down intelligence traps, essentially. How can we get those stories out better? Can we talk about more how and why people never didn't question these narratives when Russia presented them seriously? I mean, Russia is not really a believable interlocutor to begin with, and when you're telling people that the president of a Christian majority country is suddenly just generically randomly starts shutting down churches, it would raise skepticism under the best of circumstances. So why is it so many people easily bought into this propaganda, and why is it working at all? Why is it not obvious that the Russian Orthodox Church is the arm of the state and doing what the FSB and tells it to?
One of the things, and obviously you're speaking of the legislation last fall that Ukraine passed to ask the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchy to sever its ties with Moscow, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one. I mean, I just even saying it like that, which is exactly what's going on. Ukraine is asking this church to cut their ties with Patriarch Kirill, who has declared a holy war against their nation. I think one of the things that we point out is the U.S. has a history with this as well. During our own revolution, there was the Anglican Church, and Anglican Church leaders, the priests there, took an oath to God, as well as the king, and I think Parliament in some cases, right? So the Continental Congress passed laws saying, hey, the God part's great, but you can't be loyal to a foreign power that we're
Mm-hmm.
at war with. You gotta cut that part. And it was very messy and it was tough. And that's why we have an Episcopal church, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what happened was you saw a flourishing of independent Protestant churches in America based on that. And so Ukraine's no different. They've got a church there, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchy. And I think it's really easy to say, well, those guys are all Russian spies and that kind of stuff. That's not true, right? 22 of the priests and pastors that Russia has killed are Orthodox. And I think 12 of them were Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchy. So it's not fair, I think, to cast that whole
Mm-hmm.
denomination as absolutely pro-Russia. Now, what is true, over 100 priests from that denomination have been convicted of spying and hiding weapons and preaching surrender. So what the issue is not necessarily that church. It's Moscow's influence in that church. And that's what
Mhm.
Ukraine's trying to sever. But if you look at the way that they do it, let's compare Russia's um, actions against the church versus Ukraine's actions against the church. In the Ukraine version, they pass a law saying, hey, you need to break ties with Moscow. We'll give you 9 months to do it. By the time that 9 months come around, it's a six-step process with judicial review and all these things. And the worst case is you lose your registration, right? You can still actually go be a church. There's nothing in there that actually stops it. It's just you don't get registration and tax exempt status or whatever. Compare that with the Russian action against churches. It's, hey, we're coming in and seizing your church. We are now making that a military police headquarters. We might kill your pastor. We might frame him for random crimes. We might forcibly deport him, but we're going to control that whole concept. And oh, by the way, everybody needs to register. The building itself, if you can find another one, needs to register. So on the Ukrainian side, yes, they're trying to get rid of those ties with Moscow. It is a national security issue for them, just like it was for Americans fighting in our revolution. And I think that that's, to kind of bring that home to Americans of seeing like we've been through this. We've seen this play out before. When we were faced with this exact set of facts, we behaved the exact same way. And that actually was messy and it was tough, but we got to a place that worked at the end. And so that's, I mean, that's the way I describe it to people is this is exactly what happened in the American Revolution. So,
But I would add to that as well, Irina, I've run Republican campaigns for much of my career, and I thought I was really good at it until I saw what the Russians do. And, going back to that $1.6 billion that the Russians are spending on propaganda worldwide, a big chunk of that is targeted at conservatives and conservative Christians, which is how this message is getting traction.
Mhm.
And there's a team of lobbyists on Capitol Hill right now who are being paid with Russian money to say these things to members of Congress on Capitol Hill. And let me walk you through it. There's a Vadim Novinsky, who is some of you may know as a Russian oligarch who got Ukrainian citizenship from Viktor Yanukovych, the president, the pro-Russian
Yes.
president. 15 years ago, and he's and Novinsky, is Russian with Ukrainian passport, and he is currently a deacon in the Russian Orthodox Church in Switzerland, in Zurich. And he is paying this team of lobbyists to tell people that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarch is no longer connected with the Russian Orthodox Church. And again, he's a Russian billionaire who is currently a deacon in the Russian Orthodox Church, paying these lobbyists to tell people that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarch is no longer connected to Moscow. So it's just about as cynical as you can get, and it's working.
Well, that's the question about why this is why this message is resonating with people who really should know better. And I remember you were also bringing Christian delegations to DC and leadership. There was some level of personal contact. Is it that there is a big disconnect between Washington and the rest of the country? Is it that the Russians managed to penetrate into the voting base, and so it's not enough to just talk to members of Congress? Is it necessary to travel around the country and show the film to, random Americans? What's the story? Is it just that Russia is casting a wider net?
So, again, Russia, we know of payments to conservative influencers amounting to $10 million
Hmm.
last year, and that's the ones that we know about. And there's no place you can go look it up how much that conservative influencers get paid for their podcast, for their YouTube channel,
Hmm.
or who pays them. Um, you know, we ran a campaign last year for $500,000 that helped persuade members of Congress who were conservative Christians that Ukraine was worth their vote because Christians, we're telling the truth, right? And truthfully, that Russia is torturing and murdering Ukrainian Christians for their faith. And so and we spent $500,000 doing that, and we're just completely swimming upstream against these tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars the Russians are spending. So yeah, the good news is that the truth still works, and the truth overcomes falsehood, but you just got to get the money out there to do it. And so that's we're raising money, and folks who want to support our cause can go to Ukraine Freedom Project .org. That's the name of my NGO, the Ukraine Freedom Project. And every dollar that comes in through that website goes to getting this important message, not just to, you'd mentioned random Americans, not random, getting this message to conservative Christians
Hmm.
who matter, whose vote matters, conservative Christians who make up 53% of Donald Trump's voting base. So we're getting this truthful message to the people that support Trump, and it makes a difference. Colby and I both sat through screening of these movies with folks who were super pro Trump, and they get done like, wow, how do we get this message out? What can we do to make sure people hear this important message? So it's transformational. And I'll give you one quick example. There's a guy named Mark Burns who has been credited in the media with being Trump's spiritual advisor. He's a pastor from South Carolina, and he went to Ukraine at the invitation of the chief rabbi of Ukraine. And he went to Ukraine. He talked to spiritual leaders. He was there for a few days. He came back and could not wait to tell people about it. He's like, it's all over social media. He's like, Americans got to know about this spiritual struggle in Ukraine. So it's something that resonates with American Christians, with American evangelical Christians. And we've seen it. And the more people see our movie, the more people hear about our movie, then the more the truth gets out.
And let's talk about this emotional appeal because there's been a lot about fact finding and truth, and all of that, of course, is very important. It's the most important thing, but you can't discount the emotions from the equation because the Russian propaganda has very much appealed to emotions and religious ethos. And there is something about the emotional appeal of Russian propaganda that somehow struck a chord with American Christians, even though it's Ukraine and its struggle that's the quintessential American story, the story of fight for religious freedom. That's the American story. That's how the country was literally started. The founding of the US is based in the religious freedom and not just some, people wanting to make money apart and not being overtaxed by the British. Um so this somehow there is a disconnect between this religious freedom element and the lies we are hearing from Tucker. Um I am not seeing a lot of focus on that issue from the Ukrainian government, for one thing, which may be part of the problem. Is it only a question of resources, or is it a question of strategy? Are Ukrainians themselves reluctant to scale up discussion of religious issues out of, um, you know, personal concern? Why isn't
I,
there a push for designating Russia as a country that's involved in religious persecution both domestically and internationally? I feel like I'm missing something. This is such a huge element, and yet it seems to be almost in the background of everything that's going on, and the likes of Tucker Carlson seem to have monopolized the broader discussion with
I'll give you
completely distorted narratives that are even uglier than the average thing you'll hear from, Russian networks.
I think there's three things that maybe would explain this a little bit. And the first is I don't know the answer of why this propaganda kind of takes hold there. The first is we talked to a Baptist pastor that had been working in Kyiv for
Mhm.
I think more than 20 years, and he said, "Look, there's hundreds of countries in this world. You cannot follow what's going on in all of them." And so you pick voices that you trust and then you listen to them on that. And unfortunately, a lot of the voices that conservatives and Christians in the US trust are like Tucker are saying that Russia's the good guy, Ukraine's the bad guy, or at least they're both so bad they just need to be told to stop whatever it is that they're doing there. So that's I think the first point is these voices. Now, why are those voices echoing pro-Russian talking points? That is probably more of a political kind of thing, in my opinion. So I think you would get some portion of Americans that would be kind of more isolationist. So they would say, well, look, even if it's good guys and bad guys, we don't really want to be spending US money overseas to help our allies. Um, if it's good guys fighting bad guys and you say we shouldn't help, that's a tough pill to swallow, right? But if you don't want to help and you get talked into it's bad guys versus bad guys or
Mm-hmm.
who's good and who's bad is switch, then it's like, now I don't have to help and I can feel okay about it, right? So that's, kind of an isolationist
Mm-hmm.
bent. And the last one is like a lot of the US conflicts in the past 50 years have been kind of messy. And so we're we're conditioned to find faults in the folks that we're supporting. It's just the way it's just the way Americans view that kind of stuff. So, you say, well, the Ukrainian government, well, they're fighting the good fight, but what's really going on, right? What's the real story? And just that kind of conspiratorial thinking is it's kind of almost ingrained. The great thing about all that is the bad part. The good part is if you get people the accurate message, they will take action based on that.
Mm-hmm.
And as Stephen said, when Pastor Burns went over to Ukraine, it was like, wow, this is amazing. I totally see what's going on. And he couldn't stop talking about what a big issue this was and how we need to be on the right side of history and those kind of things. Most American Christians are not going to get on a plane and fly to Poland and then take a train into Ukraine, right? That's just not feasible. But a film like A Faith Under Siege, it gives that virtual experience of coming to Ukraine, talking to these Christians that have lived through this, and that in itself is very powerful. So hearing the truth from people that have lived through it is tremendously powerful. And I wish there was some way to get, every pastor in the U.S. to come over and just spend a little time with Ukrainian Christians that are going through this. That's not feasible, but this movie is to let them get a glimpse into what's going on there. And I think the second thing is, a lot of the Ukrainians I met are just really humble folks, right? So we met Pastor Oleg in Kherson. He showed up, we interviewed him, and as he was leaving, his car was, really messed up. Like all kinds of issues with it. And I asked him, like, what happened to your car? He's like, well, the Russians drone bombed it a little while back. And I was like, what? We just interviewed for an hour and a half, and you didn't mention the fact that you got blown up by the Russians? And he's like, yeah, my kids were in the car at the time. It was really bad. They all have kind of shrapnel wounds. And not only that, but this was his third minivan that had been hit by the Russians. He himself has been attacked 5 times, and he's a civilian pastor in Kherson. I didn't ask about it because I didn't know, and he never brought it up. He's just a really humble guy. Um, and so those are the stories that we feel like this, getting this story out there and proactively finding that. So we actually made a short film about him, his story himself. And if you ask him, even after getting hit 5 times by Russian drone bombs, because in Kherson, I'm sure you've heard about this, the Russians call it a human safari. So
Mm-hmm.
they'll go around with these drones with bombs on them, and they're hitting people on bikes, they're hitting, kids, minivans, all these kind of things. And he's been hit a bunch of times. And I asked him, I'm like, are you being targeted because you're a pastor? And he's like, no, I think it's just bad luck. Like, man, so it's just fascinating. Now, the here's the thing that I think really would resonate or will resonate with American Christians is his church had about 50 people before the Russia invaded. After Russia invaded and the territory was occupied, they shut down a lot of the adjacent churches. So his church actually expanded a little bit to maybe like 100 people because the other churches were being shut down.
Mm-hmm.
After Ukraine liberated Kherson, sometimes 500 people, sometimes 600 people. They've got people in the parking lots. They had to set up speakers. That's how powerful that message is. So that concept of faith and defiance is really, really there. His church has grown immensely once Ukraine has liberated that territory and religious freedom came back to his city.
This
But I
is
would add also
mhm.
with Pastor Oleg and Kherson, he thinks it's bad luck, but you ask him, "Hey, Pastor, where were you coming home from whenever you got attacked?" He's like, "Well, I was coming out of a friend's church." All right, so the Russians are targeting cars that are coming out of churches, and Pastor Oleg goes to a lot of churches, so he's been hit a lot of times. Is maybe the dots he may not be connecting, but it seems obvious when he tells it. So
I think he's being targeted, but I'm
yeah,
not sure. I
I
mean,
mean, it
see,
may
this
be bad
this gets
luck, or it may be, but it may be Russian intent. But it certainly is a miracle that he survived all these efforts.
absolutely.
That's one
yeah.
thing I'll say for sure. So what is the next step? Because right now I'm reading horrifying data that the polarization, the divide on this issue between Republicans and Democrats is growing. The Democrat support for Ukraine is actually increasing, and the Republican support for Ukraine, not necessarily trust in Putin, but support for Ukraine, is falling rapidly. And I'm hearing from my friends who are trying to organize Ukraine oriented events that not only is there no appetite for them, but there is almost a preemptive self censorship in drawing attention to the issue, and even on a cultural level, out of concern that the MAGA crowds will react, or the government will take an unkind view of the situation and retaliate in some way. So what is there to do next? How can the story be brought to wider audiences, raise funding, get to people who matter financially and politically, when many of them are the ones who are contributing to these growing concerns and this growing anti-Ukraine sentiment?
Yeah, I'll start with that one. And one thing more broad, so one, help us get this message out. This is the effective message. The message that Russia is kidnapping Ukrainian children, almost 20,000 that we know of.
Mm-hmm.
The Russians have said that as many as 730,000 Ukrainian children are in Russia, and as you know, they've part of the reason that Russia started this war is because they got a demographic problem, and their birth rate's low, their abortion rate's high. As Colby will tell you, the ratio of abortions to live births in Russia is one of the largest in the world. It's one of the they're taking Ukrainian children, as many in the hundreds of thousands, into Russia to bolster their birth rate and rebuild their armies, that sort of thing, with people they believe are of Russian heritage. Um, so these are important messages that need to get out. One of the things that I've worked with the pro-Ukraine community for 3 years now, trying to build conservative support for Ukraine, and one of the things that is I see happening is that the pro-Ukraine community in America and the Ukrainian government more broadly doesn't understand how to talk to Republicans. And so Donald Trump has said a lot of things they don't like, and I don't like him either. And so their instinct is to go protest him, to go
Mm-hmm.
stalk JD Vance, and these are counterproductive things to do.
Mm-hmm.
Zelensky has three options. He can get the security guarantees and the weapons he needs from Trump and the Americans. He can get the security guarantees and the weapons um, from the Europeans, or he can continue to fight and get the weapons where he can, which is a viable option because Ukraine has one of the most powerful armies in Europe right now, and they have a thriving defense tech business that America can learn a lot from.
Mm-hmm.
So, uh, if you look at these three options, we're fully aware of the hurdles associated with Donald Trump. But what most people don't know is that Belgium controls $258 billion in frozen Russian assets, and
Mhm.
and they've done virtually nothing with it since the beginning of the war. And meanwhile, Belgium has sent more money to Russia in the form of payments for cheap liquid natural gas than they have to Ukraine for its defense.
Mhm.
So, and France does the same thing. Spain does the same thing. The EU as a whole has sent more money to Russia for LNG, cheap LNG, than they have to Ukraine for its defense. And there's 11 countries that export liquid natural gas,
Mhm.
and and 10 of them are not using their proceeds to attack a European country. One of them undercuts everyone else's prices. That's the one the Europeans are buying from. So listen, if you want to protest somebody, go storm the Belgian embassy because they can
Mhm.
solve Ukraine's problems in 30 days, and they have not been a good partner to Ukraine. And and two things with if Ukrainian pro-Ukraine activists were to put pressure on Belgian and the Belgians and the Europeans more broadly, one, they might care because Trump is not particularly interested in public opinion, except from his voter base, like the Christians we're talking to. But so they might care. And two, the Trump supporters would say, "What? What's going on here? The Ukrainians agree with this that Europe's the problem.
Mhm.
Maybe we should take another look at those guys." So
Mhm.
it'd be super smart. I'm telling everybody. I spoke yesterday to a group of pro-Ukraine activists on Capitol Hill. I just told storm the Belgian embassy. That I think that's a good move.
That's something I think we both can agree on, and that has not been the the number one European lead on any of this. That's for sure. Considering, the tiny Lithuania, and their outsized contributions, this, supposed to
Estonia,
be,
yeah, yeah. Poland spends more in defense as a percentage of GDP than any country not currently at war in the world. And so, yeah,
I think it's the political side of this is so complex, right? And you look at previous administrations, when Russia first invaded, Obama sent blankets, right? And then the Trump administration sent javelins,
yeah,
but not enough, right? And so looking at that in the political side is just so complex, and that's one of the things that thankfully we're able to do with the movie is to say this isn't about politics. We're not trying to take a political stance with this.
Mhm.
You need to know about these issues.
Mhm.
And to me, it really kind of comes back to I grew up under, Reagan, right? And really admired his, strong stances against evil forces in the world. And I think that's something that really resonates with a lot of the older generation, especially of Republicans, is like they remember the Cold War. They remember, we pushed back against the bad guys and we won. But it took a long time and it was hard. And
Yeah.
so, that's something that I think, we really it's two of those things that kind of harkens back to that. But secondly, with the movie, what we're trying to say is like this transcends politics, right? Everybody is against abduction of children. Everybody is against murdering pastors. Everybody is against religious suppression and the
Mhm.
kind of things that Russia is doing. This is something that like can bring us together. Everything tries to be this, well, what do the Democrats think? What do the Republicans think? I think the opposite of it. This is one of those things that absolutely transcends the party divide here, and that's why we really want to get this out in front of all audiences, especially those that would be, on the right side of the spectrum to see
Sure.
like, look, these are people that worship God like you. These are people that love freedom like you. You need to know about this. Do with that what you will, but you need to know this. You need to know the truth about these issues. So I think it's something that rises above the political divide in the US. I think anybody would see this would say those things are wrong. Abducting children on a mass scale during a conflict is wrong. Killing pastors is wrong. We all agree on that.
There's something I'm going to say that's a little bit controversial and concerns both Democrats and Republicans and everybody in between and outside of that, which is that I feel like Americans have forgotten how to win. But I don't just mean win in the military sense, although, as you mentioned, the recent conflicts have been messy and complicated and morally dubious in some sense. But they've forgotten how to achieve moral victories and to derive satisfaction from doing these sort of things, good things in public that bring about clear moral results that resonate with American consciousness, American values, American history, like fighting for freedom of religion, like drawing clear moral lines on these issues and realizing there is a moral truth, there is a clear moral absolute, and the moral relativism does not belong in this discussion. It's not, and I think kind of drawing attention to that. I think this could be a very powerful awakening message to many, especially younger people who don't have that Cold War experience to look up to, or who may not be, unfortunately, as familiar with the U.S. history and how it was founded and what Americans are supposed to value. Yes, there was a historic isolationist stream, but it needs to be put in context. It was not isolationism for the sake of not having good relations with it, and it was certainly not without also valuing the and protecting the very freedoms that made it possible to have a place to be a part if one wishes. So I just think this powerful message needs wider audience. It needs to travel the country. It needs to go beyond Washington and the political morass and infighting and into the homes of average Americans.
Yeah, I
That's
agree.
what
And
we're
I think
doing.
that's what we're doing. One more thing too, I think to point out, we're not making money on this movie,
Sure.
right? This is not one that we're not even recouping costs. If we do make any money on it, it goes right back into marketing so more people
Mm-hmm.
can see it or to support the nonprofits that have helped us get this far. So I would say for anybody out there, if you go to faithundersiege.com, you can see there's ways to screen this for free in your church or your community organization. It'll be available on a variety of streaming platforms. So if you feel strongly about this issue, the way to help is to go watch this movie and get your friends to watch it and bring it to your church or your community group or whatever. Get that message out there. And with everybody working together on this, I think Winston Churchill famously said, Americans always do the right thing after they've exhausted all other options, right? That's the joke that he told around kind of World War II. And Americans are good folks that love freedom and love freedom of religion. It gets messy with all the politics, but that's where we really feel like this movie can bring us together. And our goal would be, just that everybody sees this. Of course, not everybody in the world's gonna see it, or even America, but
Mm-hmm.
that's the way to help is to promote this film. Watch it and get your friends to watch it and host a screening. It's all very easy on the website. And there's a lot of extra content too, and individual stories that we weren't able to get into the movie on there. So it's interesting as well. It's not just a piece that's mobilizing folks. It's good cinema as well.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and I would add,
Mhm.
folks are frustrated right now, particularly pro-Ukraine folks are frustrated, and the way to um, channel that frustration energy is to take our film, go to the pastor of your church, have him watch it, and then ask him to host a screening of this film in his church. If you're part of a community group, any way that it's important that Christian eyeballs get on this film, and so help us do that. And go to Faith Under Siege and watch it and take it to your pastor.
Thank you so much, and thank you for outlining these actionable items. It's very important to have a plan, to know what to do, and not just to feel frustrated and upset. That doesn't really lead to anything. Thank you to you both for your important work and for this enriching and enlightening discussion. And best of success in your endeavor. And I hope that the more people hear about it, including from this program, the more they'll be inspired to join in.
Irina, thank you
Дякую,
so much.
Irina.
Thank you so much. And for everyone watching it, we'll be back again next week, Tuesday night, 9 p.m., the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thanks to Steven. Thanks to Colby. Have a great evening, everyone.